Hey everyone, this is Kevin from thechesswebsite.com, and today we're in game number 7 of the 2018 World Chess Championship in London, England, between the champion Magnus Carlsen and the challenger Fabiano Caruana, who won the Candidates Tournament earlier this year to face off with Magnus Carlsen here in the World Championship. We have 6 games so far, and we have 6 draws. That brings us to game number 7 in the second half of this tournament. It is a 12-game tournament. If we do have a draw after 12 games, it doesn't matter if we have wins until then, but if both sides are equal in points, then we will have some rapid and blitz after the 12 games. This did happen 2 years ago when Magnus went up against Sergei Karyakin. Magnus was victorious in that. But we'll see. Before we get to the end of the draws, we have to see if someone's actually going to get a victory in the normal classical chess. Starts here with Magnus Carlsen in the white pieces, game number 7. He also had him in game 6. So we do flip the white and the black pieces. Magnus Carlsen will have the black pieces in the final game in game number 12 if we actually get there. But today, Magnus starts with the white pieces, and he starts out with pawn to d4. So we did see 2 days ago in game 6, he tried going into the Petrov defense. Fabiano, extremely well-versed in that opening and seemed to be better going into the middle game. Did not end up doing too much from there. And so you see Magnus Carlsen opting for something different. Plays pawn here to d4. Knight to f6, knight f3, pawn d5, pawn c4, getting into the queen's gambit line. And then pawn to e6. This is the queen's gambit decline line. If this looks familiar, it should if you've been following the tournament, especially after bishop to f4. We talked about this earlier in game number 2. This is the same opening that Magnus Carlsen played, and they played the exact same opening all the way until move number 10, and the players were going so fast, spending almost no time on their moves, and that brings us to this point in the game. Now, in game number 2, Magnus Carlsen played rook to d1. In this particular game, he decided to change things up and play knight to d2. For those looking at the position, curious why instead of knight to d2, pawn just didn't come up here to b4, since it's attacking both the bishop and the queen. The bishop can freely take here. The pawn can't recapture. The queen could come down here to a1. So that's why we don't see that move. Instead, we see knight to d2. Now, as fast as the first 10 moves were from the players, only took a few minutes off the clock. The next 4 moves took over an hour and a half. For those actually watching the stream, following along with the game, there were times where I didn't have the sound on. I was curious. I had to refresh. I just felt for sure that some moves were taking place. They were not. Just took a long time for both players to go through the motions, trying to figure out how they're going to continue. Fabiano starts out with queen to d8. I feel like this is where Magnus Carlsen was just not sure what to do from here. I don't think he expected this move at all, because you generally don't see your opponent get your queen involved and then immediately come back to d8, especially when it's not under any threat right now. So we see knight to b3. Bishop comes back here to b6 since it is under attack. Bishop to e2, getting ready to castle on the king side. Queen to e6. So maybe this is a better square that Fabiano wants to get to. Bishop to g5, pinning down the knight. Pawn takes here on c4. Knight comes back here to d2. Could have also just taken with his bishop if he wants to. But since he knows it's going to be very difficult for his opponent to hold on to this material, he can take it in a variety of ways. He decides he wants to bring his knight back here to d2. Now he can come up to c4. More aggressive square for the knight. He can also take it with his bishop if he wants to, but this gives him more options in the game. Knight to e5, and then castle on the king side. Now, Magnus did have a lot of options. After the games, they always ask certain situations, doesn't matter how the game ended up. They go back and just say, what were you thinking in this position? You know, did you plan on the queen's gambit decline the entire time, or did you take the day off and you come back to this and you just didn't really like the Petrov? Or what did you think about queen to d8? Did that catch you by surprise? This position right here, they did ask him a lot of questions about. And he said that there was a couple options in his head that he was going through. He wanted to play something like pawn to f4, but he just couldn't find any solid lines from here. He also said that he probably could have and should have been more aggressive with knight to e4, but from here he decided instead to play just castle on the king side. Not very aggressive for Magnus Carlsen. Safe move, absolutely, but could have been more aggressive. His king was under no threat at the moment. Bishop to d7. Bishop comes back here to f4. Knight to g6. Now attacking the bishop. Bishop comes back here to g3. Bishop to c6. Knight up here to c4. So we talked about how White wanted to capture this material. Decides to go ahead and capture it with his knight. Also now attacking this bishop here on b6. With the knight attacking the bishop, bishop comes back here to c7, and then we get the rooks involved into the game. Could have brought the rooks in earlier, but now you want to start to control these open files. So rook here to d1, rook to d8, just counterattacking, and we do see some exchanging on the board, immediately met by rook over here to d1, and the rooks come off the board. Knight to d5, nice little outpost in the center of the board. Queen comes up here to d4. Could have taken immediately if he wants to, but he knows that the knight could come, take here, and then he wants to have his queen there to take back. Doesn't want to have two isolated pawns here with a pawn here on c3 as well as pawn to a3. So wants to recapture with his queen. He could come to d2, but since he doesn't know exactly what his opponent's going to do, he'd rather have it up here on d4 compared to d2 just because it's more centralized. And so if his opponent does want to wait a little while, he can have some additional threats on the board. Things like pawn to a7 he is attacking. So queen to d4, knight takes, and then the queen recaptures here on c3. Bishop comes down here, takes on g3, and then the pawn takes here from the h-file. Always important to make sure that you know how to take with your pawns. Most people will tell you just take towards the center. Not always the case, but this is one example. You definitely want to do that. And the main reason for that is you don't want to have isolated pawns. So if you take with your pawn from the f-file, you can see this pawn isolated here in the center of the board. With two minor pieces and a queen, it just gives your opponent something to attack the rest of the game. Whereas you take your pawn to g3, you still have a nice pawn chain, and these pawns are just going to help each other. So while you do have double pawns on the g-file, it's not necessarily a bad thing. Many times you can get rid of one of those pawns pretty easily. Queen to d7, a bishop up here to d3, attacking the knights. Pawn to b6, pawn up here to f3, just consolidating a little bit, stopping the bishop from attacking this pawn down here on a g2. Bishop comes back to b7. Bishop now takes on g6. And we see the same thing. The pawn takes from the h-file. Does not want to take from the f-file for the reasons we just talked about. Pawn to e4. Queen over here to c7, attacking the pawn on g3. So we see pawn e5 stopping that. It is stopped from this knight here on c4. This is defending it. Queen comes down here to a c5 check, king to h2, chasing it around a little bit. Bishop to a6, attacking the knight. Knight comes up to d6. This is a nice little outpost. Now the queen is also defending the pawn as well. But it's tough to really see a clear attack that Magnus Carlsen has. He has a good position. I think it'd be tough for him to lose here, but it is tough to see how he will continue. Decides to go ahead and take with his queen on a c3, pawn recapture. So as far as pawn structure, I definitely like Black's pawn structure. But one thing Magnus Carlsen has going for him is the fact that his opponent has a bishop. Very easy to just put all your material on the opposite colored square. So he has both his pawns here on the dark colored squares. He can start to move his other pieces there as well. Pretty much just negates all of the strength that this light square bishop has. f6 from Fabiano. Pawn here to f4, just solidifying the pawn chain. Also getting him on the dark squares as we talked about. King to f8, getting the king involved into the game. King to g1. King down here to e7. You're not going to kick off this knight. It's a great little outpost. King to f2. King to d7. king starts to come up to e3, and then all of a sudden Fabiano says, yeah, I'm going to attack this pawn here on g2. Magnus really doesn't have an option. He needs to come back to f2, and so Fabiano can essentially force this action. As soon as the king comes back, then we're just going to repeat. And so after 40 moves, the players decide to draw. So 7 games in, we do have 7 draws, much like the last World Championship. We'll be curious to see if Fabiano can come back tomorrow in Game 8, break this thing up as he has the white pieces. But hopefully you guys are enjoying the tournament. I know there are a lot of draws. Most people, including myself, want to see a lot of wins, but this does happen once every 2 years. So try and just enjoy this high-level play as much as possible. But appreciate you guys watching. I'll see you in tomorrow's video for game number 8.